This is the Naked Mole Rat podcast by Libo Studio. I'm Ilya Kolmanovsky. This show is about science, and we do it every 2 weeks in Russian. But many interviews are conducted in English, so we decided to go ahead and put them online, with only some minor edits done to them. Our guests are world-class experts, and they usually have a great way of telling stories of their discoveries. So we're asking you, speaking of discoveries, make sure to hit all the subscribe and like buttons, and please spread the word so that your English or Russian-speaking friends discover the Naked Mole Rat podcast. Our guest today made an unusual request. I conduct most of the interviews via Zoom, and although I don't need video, I tend to use video calling just to get a better sense of who am I talking to. But Alina Chan from Broad Institute at Cambridge, Massachusetts, requested the video to be turned off for security reasons. Her involvement and even leading role in the international investigation of the lab leak version for the new coronavirus made quite a stir. A year and a half ago, no one with serious credentials would even bother to consider a lab leak version as a possibility. A much less extravagant version of the cold food market spillover looked undisputable. But not for Chan, and not for a small but very active group of scientists in the US, Singapore, Australia, Europe, who started gathering evidence in the support for the lab leak version. This has climaxed, as you have probably heard, in a major shift of consensus last spring. The lab leak version is now considered much less of a conspiracy theory, but something that demands a serious investigation. While we should be expecting a new official body with expertise and mandate to continue digging anytime now, let's hear the story from the original source, Alina Chan herself.
My name is Alina Chan. I work at the Broad Institute of MIT in Harvard. I'm a postdoc at the institute, and I specialize in gene therapy and genetic engineering.
Please tell us how this started. How did your interest in lab leak version started?
In early 2020, when we were just learning about how dangerous this virus could be. I mean, remember at the time that people were still saying that this was nothing to panic about, that it was less dangerous than the flu, and everyone should just keep living normally and not take any precautions, essentially. But it was pretty serious, I think, in Boston already by March 2020, because there had been the outbreak at a local conference, the Biogen conference. And so we had all been sent home from the Broad to be safe. And so I started reading a lot about this virus. And I noticed that it was different from the first SARS virus that broke out in 2003.
How different?
The difference, different in a way that is surprising to me. And I think it was also surprising, or at least curious, to other specialists in the field. The difference is that in the case of SARS-1, the one that broke out in 2003, almost 2 decades ago now, you could see this stepwise evolution of the virus in the first few months. When it just jumped from animals into humans, it was adapting to the host, the new host species, which was humans. So it accumulated dozens of mutations, and some of these were later found to be functionally advantageous to the virus, so it made it better at infecting and transmitting amongst humans, better at using the human receptor. But in the case of SARS-2, from the time that we had detected it in December, it was already at a ceiling. It already hit a ceiling of fitness. So we saw very few changes in the genome compared to in SARS-1, the first few months. For SARS-2, it was genetically stable, so stable that many scientists at the time in early 2020 said, this is a good sign, because it means that we can design drugs, we can design vaccines, and these hopefully will not be overtaken by new variants. That's kind of changed now in the face of all its new variants a whole year later. But at the time, they were actually relieved to see that the virus was not changing drastically, that it was not diversifying into different strains that would make it very difficult to contain.
Okay, and what could be the explanation for that difference, for that peculiarity of SARS-2?
So we put out a preprint in May 2020, and we gave it 3 different options. So the first option was that this virus somehow inside the intermediate host was already so good at infecting humans and transmitting amongst humans that it didn't need to change much. I think a lot of people don't like that idea, because the idea that it's in a different species entirely, and it's already very good at spreading amongst humans doesn't need to change at all. Like not even any handful of mutations can make it better at infecting humans. I think it's unlikely unless there's some colony of primates in Wuhan that we're not aware of that jumped from monkeys to humans. So in the case of SARS-1, when it jumped from civets, which are really, this virus can spread very easily among civets too, it still had space to improve. It's still a space to evolve into a better version for humans. And the second option was that this virus had been in humans for many months already, or maybe even years, but we had not seen that pre-circulation, so there was no detection of it. But this could be easily answered by going through banked human samples from Wuhan, from other parts of China, to see are there any traces of this virus. So the curious thing is that China has not done that. It has these biobanks, and some of them, they only store the samples for 2 years. So if it was stored in 2019, it's due for destruction this year. They have not gone back to these biobanks to check whether the virus could have been circulating in these populations in Wuhan or other places in China. Either they haven't done it or they've done it, but they're not telling us. So that scenario is also difficult for us to know whether that's what happened. And the last scenario, which is the most controversial one, is that this virus had spent some time in a lab inside a human cell model or inside an animal that was humanized, possibly a mouse with a human ACE2 receptor, before accidentally leaking out into the community.
What could be some other signs of this latter version being actually true? Are there any other arguments for it?
The main reason why many scientists and non-scientists think that the lab leak has some water in it, that it carries water, is that the location, it's the location of the outbreak. It's a city where there isn't normally spillover of SARS viruses. So, but right there in that city, you've got possibly the world's greatest SARS collection of viruses. So if you just look at it logically, this city, they've done studies over the past decade, checking hundreds of humans in the city as a negative control. They never found any signs of SARS viruses. They checked thousands of bats in that province, never found any of these SARS viruses that could infect humans. All of the SARS-2 relatives, the closest viruses related to SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, they all only have been found in Yunnan province in South China, more than 1,000 kilometers away. Wuhan city, extremely modern city, is like a New York city. It's not a place where people are farming and being exposed to bat caves and that kind of thing. So what is the most logical way for a virus to make its way from bats in Yunnan province all the way into humans in Wuhan? Is it through the wildlife market trade? Or is it through these labs that send dozens of people into these caves every year and bring back thousands of samples? So that is really the crux of the issue.
What was the feedback back then, a year ago? What was the attitude toward your findings?
So I'm still an outsider to this field. So I'm not a virologist. So my training is not in virus biology, even though I do work with viruses in the lab. I was not aware of who were, the big cheeses in the field. I wasn't aware of who I should avoid stepping toes on. But I soon found out when the preprint went out and it started getting more attention, there was immediate backlash from a man called Peter Daszak. He's the president of this EcoHealth Alliance, which has worked with the WIV since the first SARS outbreak in 2004 and 3. So he, unbeknownst to me at the time, he had already published a letter in The Lancet in February of 2020 saying that they condemned all conspiracy theories, saying that this virus did not have a natural origin. So that letter had kind of set the tone for the rest of the scientific community because it had so many, in more than 24 signatories, all extremely prominent virologists and also people who tend to be the ones controlling the funding in science. So I was not aware of that. I was a postdoc, just outsider. I just wanted to publish my preprint and show people this is very strange and we should look into it. So I think I was immediately submerged into a different field where it was very taboo to even bring up the idea of could this have leaked from a lab.
Could you elaborate? Yeah. Why was this a taboo?
So I think there are at least two main reasons for that. One of it is that it had become very fraught geopolitically. So both US and China were trading conspiracy theories with each other at the time. So they were both accusing each other of leaking it from a lab. Trump and Mike Pompeo are pretty famous for having said that they've seen evidence that the virus came from the lab. But China had also accused the US of bringing it to Wuhan during the military games in 2019. So it was ugly. Like it just was not a safe space for scientists to try and have a very scientific discussion of the topic. The second reason is that there had been this very long and painful debate on gain of function research. So gain of function research is like this really ambiguous definition. But the idea was that there had been dozens of scientists publicly arguing about whether or not risky pathogen research should be done in labs because they worried that such work could result in a pandemic. So this was not a scientific consensus. It wasn't like all scientists were for this research or all against this research. They had been fighting about it since 2011. So for these reasons, it was very difficult to mention the idea of a lab leak resulting in a pandemic.
I need to add a comment right here. What is a gain-of-function experiment? The thing is, sometimes scientists are making some dangerous viruses even more dangerous. The way to do this is to try and breed new strains that would be better adapted to human cells in the lab culture. And this practice has a rationale behind it, and that is to predict which strains collected from nature have a pandemic potential.
Did it somehow change over the last year? And if so, how did it change?
Yes, I think this the space surrounding the lab leak, surrounding the origins of SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19 has changed a lot in the last year. So last year, this time last year, it was mainly represented in the media and by scientists that a lab origin was a conspiracy theory. So they were saying that only non-scientists or anti-science people were spreading misinformation or disinformation, claiming that this virus could have come from a lab. Some very outspoken scientists, such as Peter Daszak, and also some authors who wrote a piece in Nature Medicine called The Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2, they had all claimed that no lab-based scenario was plausible. So for a scientist like me to step up and say, this could have leaked from a lab, guys, that was seen as either me being extremely foolish and incompetent or being a crazy person. And so that has changed completely now. So about a week ago, finally in Science magazine, so one of the most well-known scientific publications in the world, 18 top scientists, maybe don't count me in that, but at least 17 top scientists signed this letter saying that we have to investigate. We have to have a credible and rigorous, transparent and timely investigation into both laboratory and natural origin hypotheses.
How did that happen, by the way? How did that Science magazine letter emerge?
Yeah, so I think David Relman can tell you a lot more about that. The letter was, I think, inspired by the China WHO joint study that had just concluded its phase 1 study at the time. So at the end of March, this half Chinese and half WHO convened team had published their full report on the origins of COVID-19. At the same time, when the report was released, the Director General of the WHO, he said that he was ready to deploy new missions if needed to investigate a lab leak. So many scientists separately thought at the time that this was the time, if ever, for scientists to take a stance and say we need this investigation, that this was the time. Furthermore, both the European Union as well as 14 countries, including the US, had both separately published statements about this study that the China WHO team had conducted, saying that they want a more transparent and more or less politically influenced investigation to actually happen.
Was this entirely their own initiative? Did you play a part in it, or rather they invited you?
Yes, I played a part in it. So I had known Jesse and David separately over the past year of me stirring up trouble on Twitter. And so when the WHO Director General, when he made that statement, I reached out to both Jesse and David and I said, have you guys been thinking about writing a letter? And they both said yes, they want to write a letter, and they had been thinking about this for a while. And so so they took the reins after that. I can't claim really any credit for this at all. The two of them, this letter only happened because of both of them. Like, they're just both such incredibly well-respected scientists. They're very grounded. They're not the type to speculate and say like unsubstantiated things. They're both just highly respected by peers in their field. So when it came time for them to write this letter, it was an easy decision for a lot of people that they knew, and a lot of the signatories, because they knew that this letter was being organized by two of the most solid scientists you can find in the world. So all the credit really goes to Jesse and David.
Thank you. I see. Another thing I wanted to ask, it's a bit hard for me to figure out what's what as an outsider, but what I hear you say is that the previous administration created this really ugly context for any, reasonable delving into the subject. How did the change of administration influence the context, if it did?
It influenced the context a lot. And I think some scientists will admit it, but others will insist that no, the change of administration didn't change their minds. But in my perspective, it changed the setting a lot. Because by the time the second administration rolled in, we were seeing comments from from both State Departments saying that they could verify that a fact sheet that had been published by the Trump administration State Department, saying that they had intelligence suggesting that it was plausible that this virus had come from the Wuhan Institute of Virology or another lab in Wuhan. Not only that, but the CDC director of the previous CDC director had gone on CNN telling people that, in his opinion, the most likely origin was a lab. So there was just more and more voices, not just from the past administration, but the new administration, saying that we have to keep both hypotheses on the table. So both lab and natural, they're still on the table. We can't rule them out. And we need to gather information. And so knowing that this wasn't a hypothesis owned by Trump, I think helped a lot of scientists to say, yeah, we need to gather information. We need to really not be ruling out one prematurely just to spite Trump and conservatives, right? Yeah.
I would like to ask you, people I talk to, they keep mentioning that there were attempts to silence you. Could you please talk about that a little?
I mean, I don't think that it's easy to measure it. Like, when you say that you're being silenced, it's hard to put a number to it or to
just describe
rigorously assess it, because it's difficult for me to see how much of it is my fault as a inexperienced, like, younger scientist, versus how much of it is like actual pushback. So I'm sure there's a mix of both, but I'm not sure how much of my inability to get my analysis and that of my colleagues through peer review on just this topic is due to my incompetence, versus how much of it is the resistance from the scientific community of talking about this. But what I can say is that from some of the peer review that I've received, that I've seen the comments from the peer reviewers, I think that there is a lack of objectivity on this topic, is that they're happy to let people speculate all sorts of crazy stuff about how this could have arisen naturally, whether it's through frozen foods or like pangolins and things like that, with zero evidence that this ever happened. But any word or mention of a lab leak is seen as a heinous, like, speculation or conspiracy theory. So I think that it would help us all if scientists could really sit down and realize that there's zero evidence for natural origin, even like 1.5 years post-outbreak. There's also zero evidence for a lab leak. Everything is all circumstantial right now. So if we're gonna unleash the dam and let people speculate about natural origins until kingdom come, then we should also allow speculation on lab leak.
How was your investigation looked upon at the institute where you work? What was the attitude from the management?
So I think postdocs are in a kind of different scenario than regular employees, because postdocs are supposed to be exploring new venues and training and looking into questions that they're interested in. My supervisor has been incredibly supportive and actually discuss some of these analysis with me too. He's actually a co-author on my preprint, on the May preprint. So, and he's also a signatory on that science letter. So he knows that this is an extremely important topic. Seriously, the consequences of this could impact millions of lives. Because if it did come from a lab, we really need to think about how we do this sort of virus or pathogen research around the world. A lot of people are quite short-term minded. They think as long as we get over this pandemic, it's fine. But the problem is, what if this sort of research is being expanded massively? We know that lots of countries, including China and even the US, are building more and more high biosafety level labs in like very highly densely populated cities. So what happens if the frequency of these pandemics increases? Like, what if one of this happens every 5 to 10 years now? So we really need to have a serious conversation about this. In terms of the broader institute, like, no one at a high level has reached out to me to say you can do this or you should do this. Like, no one's ever said that. What I've gotten is a lot of support from the broad communications team, just like telling me like you need to be careful sometimes with these because there's some people out there who can really take this the wrong way. And they're saying this because they've seen the emails, they've intercepted the emails coming into my inbox or to other people about me. So there are some unhinged people out there that could, and that's one reason why I don't want to be recorded like on the video or things like that, because it's just, I think, quite dangerous for me right now.
Forgive me for digging into it. Just briefly, what kind of people are these? What's their background?
I don't really want to like dox them or things like that, but I'll say that I'm getting pushback from both sides, from scientists, from other scientists, and also from people who have very strong feelings about this topic. So some of the language in these emails have been violent. So I think
like what? Can you quote the worst?
I don't really want to talk about it. I kind of feel like some of these people, they want to get attention. They want to hear that I'm getting like annoyed or I'm getting threatened by them. So I'd rather not help their words reach like millions of people.
Understood. Yeah. Understood. Could you please talk a little bit about that particular aspect? I think it's really interesting. There was this exchange between you and Dashek about the issue of that 2013 virus found in a coal mine being either sequenced or not sequenced. Could you please
unpack it?
Unpack it, or just explain this to us?
Yeah, so this really is an issue that has been revealed by the help of like internet sleuths. They don't like to be called that, but some of them are actually experts. Some of them are actually scientists or data analysts. And so what they discovered was that in the first paper on COVID-19 published by the Wuhan Institute of Virology, they mentioned that they had in their possession the most closely related relative. Even till today, it remains the most closely related virus to SARS-CoV-2. So this genome is a 96% match to SARS-CoV-2. And its name is RATG13. So RA for the type of bat it came from, TG for the location, and 13 for 2013 when it was sampled from a mine. And this WIV paper, it didn't mention that this virus had been collected from a mine where people had died from and sickened from a SARS-like illness in 2012. So this case of the miners who had gotten this SARS-like illness, it was followed up by many top labs, followed up by the WIV, followed up by Dr. Zhongnan Shan, who is kind of like the Dr. Fauci of China, followed up by the lab of the Chinese CDC director, followed up by a lab of studying pathogen biology in Beijing. And they all went into this mine, like trying to find the virus that had killed some of these miners. And the WIV, when it mentioned this RATG13 in their paper post-COVID, they didn't make that connection. They didn't say we got this because we were searching for a killer virus. So like, and the way that they phrased it in the paper even made it sound like they had just thrown it in the fridge or the freezer for 6 years without studying it. So they said that they had found a short sequence match and then they full genome sequenced the virus. So Peter Daszak had gone around to various media, including the New York Times and Wired, telling them that, oh yeah, if we had more money, then we could have studied this more, but it was just sitting in the freezer for 6 years. And eventually, the internet sleuths found that actually no, the data showed that the WIV had been actively studying this virus. it had full genome sequenced it in 2018, but it had been studying it through 2016 and 2017 too. So
why does it matter?
Looked like it matters because of the interest in this virus. So it wasn't just this random virus that they just threw in a freezer. It was a high priority virus. And from some of the documents leaked from the WIV, from a thesis in particular that was leaked recently, it was one of the top 4 priorities for them. They went into full genome sequence this virus in 2018. And possibly because it was connected to these miners who died from a SARS-like illness in 2012. So it's not like some random sample that they threw in the fridge and forgot about. They were actively sequencing, studying, trying to understand this virus.
Now it makes sense. Some skeptics say that what is there to investigate if it were a lab leak? In a year, the institute and the party bosses would have made sure that everything is erased.
I agree that the lag of an entire year is extremely regrettable, and I think that some of that responsibility has to fall on the scientists and science journalists who kept casting this as a conspiracy theory that truly was an obstacle, and it slowed down any possible investigation into the lab leak hypothesis. But I don't think that all the hope is lost yet. There is still a lot of information out there that's outside of China. And so not just myself, but several other scientists have pointed this out too, is that in the early days of the outbreak, before China had, shut down all communications between its scientists and the outside world, there was a lot of communication. So there were many scientists outside of China talking to their co-workers in China or their friends in China. So we need to go back and collect all that information, including the information that was sent to journals in the early days, or even a month or a few months before the outbreak, because these can contain a lot of clues about how viruses were being manipulated in that place, or what viruses were being studied. And could that give us a clue as to whether SARS-2 or very similar virus to SARS-2 was in a collection in Wuhan?
It's really exciting to think that there's lots of that type of evidence just sitting there outside China, not being accumulated in one effort. That makes perfect sense.
The problem is that there has been no investigation. So this whole thing that happened with China and the WHO, each side, even China called it not an investigation. The WHO said it wasn't an investigation, and even the team leader said it wasn't an investigation. So they all said it was just a joint study. They went there and they just met with the Chinese half of the team and accepted whatever they said and wrote a full report, and everyone had to sign off on it, including the Chinese half of the team. So it was not by any means an investigation that could have collected this evidence. Like, they had no power. They had no plan to collect this type of evidence.
One of my sources also expressed this opinion that it might make sense to look at the logs of the firms which were providing supplies for Wuhan Institute from abroad. What do you think about it?
Yes, I think that's important too. There are many things we can look at, right? So the people inside China and the companies inside China, we cannot access them. But the science nowadays is so collaborative, like people talk. And I don't think that this was a bioweapon. So there would have been no reason why they would not have shared, scientific details about it with each other across the borders. It's just that this sort of information, it cannot just be plopped on the internet for the whole world to see. That there should ideally be a recognized international investigation team that can confidentially access these documents and emails and records and discuss amongst themselves, and then see what is actually important to share with the world.
You mentioned that it's really important to investigate to avoid such accidents in future. And we're talking about probably more general change of attitude and ethics of work with viruses. But also, is there any more proximate, more imminent threat which might come to life in just the next year or two? What if there were other viruses which were being modified What would that mean for our safety?
Yeah, so I think this point is very important. That the first people to be impacted is not the whole world at large, but actually the people living in the same city as the lab, right? So if I were living in the same city as a lab where this SARS-CoV-2 could have come from, I think I would be quietly trying to make my way into a different city first, just to like, can I move my whole family to a different city? Because a lot of people pointed out that SARS-CoV-2 is a pretty weak virus. Like it's got a kill rate of about 1%. Compared to SARS-1, which had a kill rate of like 10%. So like, what is the next SARS virus that leaks, whether it's from a wildlife market or from a lab, gonna look like? Is it gonna have, a much scarier kill rate than SARS-2? So this has very immediate impacts on people. This is not a in 20 years time kind of thing. This is a like in the next 5 years kind of thing. So it is just essential that we address this problem together. And it's not something that only affects people in China. It's not something that only affects people in the US. It affects everybody. Like we've seen what happens when a pandemic starts. It could be any lab. It doesn't necessarily have to be this Wuhan lab again, like that's under suspicion. Like any lab that is doing risky pathogen research, whether it's the US or anywhere else, maybe the next one is not a SARS virus. Maybe the next one is Ebola. So like we seriously have to have this global conversation about the type of research that's being done. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Done right now as we speak. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, as we speak. Yeah, as we speak.
Wow. So do you think there will be an investigation? Is there any sign of it?
Yes, I think it's inevitable right now. Finally, I think there's sufficient momentum. So besides this science letter that came out, there was already another group of scientists that wrote an earlier open letter. I was one of the signatories too, criticizing the WHO. And we now have both CDC directors of the previous and the current administration saying that the lab leak is on the table. We have the CIA director of national intelligence in the US saying that they are still gathering intel, and both hypotheses on the table. We have now a COVID commission planning group in the US by many top scientists trying to prepare for a national commission to investigate, amongst other things, the origins of the virus. And so I think there is a lot of momentum now. There's a lot of eyes on the issue. It's not going to be something that people can just sweep under the rug and revisit like 3 decades later as a master's thesis. Like this, I think people will not tolerate the absence of an investigation.
And what kind of investigation are we talking about? Would that be American investigation or American Chinese? What are we talking about?
My pragmatic point of view is that China will not be a part of any of these investigations, or we've seen enough evidence to suggest that they are unwilling to participate in a non-overtly politicized investigation. So I do hope that the next investigation will be international. I do think that they should invite China, and that China should have a big role to play in it. But I would be surprised if China agreed to play a role in that investigation.
So most likely it will be run by American government.
Or maybe by the UN.
Or maybe by the UN.
Or the WHO again.
I see. Probably the last thing I wanted to ask you about, and it's a much smaller question. I was puzzled to see Ralph Barck among the signees of the letter. How did that occur? So I think this has to do with the organizers of the letter again. So both Jesse and David are known as really fair people. They are not judgmental. And even when they disagree with you, they disagree in a way that makes you still feel like you're friends. You know, that they don't judge you. They're not like condemning you. They don't personalize disagreements. So based on their relationship with Ralph Barck, they got him to sign. I had previously also talked to Ralph Barck and got him to be on a list of experts who had independently expressed the need to investigate a lab leak hypothesis. So in my interactions with Barck, I think that he is brave. I think that he is acting against his self-interest here by saying that we need to investigate. Like, he is one of the world's most experienced and well-known SARS virus researchers. And so for him to say that, that this once-in-a-lifetime pandemic, hopefully, SARS-2 might have come from a lab, that hurts his interest as well. Why?
because he is also studying these SARS viruses in his lab. So if this came from a lab in Wuhan, could the next SARS virus, if it ever leaks again, come from his lab, right? So there's a certain amount of humility here, I think, in realizing that, maybe my lab is one of the top labs in the world, maybe we're safe all the time, but there is a very small chance that this could result in a very life-changing event for a lot of people. So I admire his participation in the science letter. I don't think many people have the humility or the honesty to sign a letter like this.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Alina, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
I would like to conclude this interview by mentioning the idea expressed by Professor David Relman from Stanford University. He was the person who put together that group of prominent scientists to sign the Science magazine letter demanding investigation for lab leak version. And he says, natural spillovers are becoming increasingly more likely, but lab leaks might be going in the exact same direction. The more labs we need to build to counter spillovers, the more experiments we conduct in our effort to counter dangerous infections, the more we should be conscious about lab safety and lab leaks' potential to cause trouble. And this was the Naked Mole Rat podcast by Libo Studio. I'm Ilya Kolmanovsky. Goodbye.